number 3, this theme covers project resource utilization, and by the end of this you should know and how to prepare a resource requirement plan, discuss resource leveling, discuss resource limited scheduling, and also discuss the critical success factors related to resource utilization. You'll find the content on pages 216 to 230 in your textbook. So let's look at technically constraint planning. What is constraint planning? So constraint planning is what we call a serial relationship that is performed in a specific sequence. It must happen in that particular sequence. In this case, we look at this example. It's a technically constrained activity sequence, which means that in order to build your house, in order to complete your house, you must first build the foundation, you build the frame of the house, and you put on the roof. You cannot build the frame without having done the foundation. You cannot put the roof on if you have not built a frame. So this is an example of what we call a constraint activity sequence. These sequence of activity must take place in that specific form. Constrained resource planning works on the same principle. It looks at the available resources that allow for concurrent tasks that can be done, and then tasks that can be done sequentially. So in this case, if we look at example of the kitchen, the start of the project, there are certain activities that can happen concurrently, and there are certain, so you can paint the lounge because you're not working in the kitchen. You can also paint the kitchen, and you can also paint the bedroom. Doing it in this particular way, what will happen? Your project time is much less. However, your project resource is much more. Why? Because it might only take you 2 days to complete, but you need 3 people painting. So as an example, you might have to end up paying 3 people to work across 2 days. Now, the cost of both of these might be the same. So it all depends on what your requirements are. Do you require your house to be painted quickly? In that case, then you have to employ 3 painters over 2 days and pay them. Or you can employ 1 painter and ask him to pay to work across 3 or maybe 3 days, 2 days to complete over 6 days, and that might be cheaper. As an example, where you have a sequential activity where you paint the lounge first, you paint the kitchen, and then the bedroom. So it all depends on do you have 3 painters at your disposal, or do you only have 1? Is it worthwhile bringing in another 2 painters in order to complete the project faster? Maybe. It depends on what your client wants. You have to put a resource, and that drives you into the resource requirements plan. It illustrates the expected resources to be used by time period, and it's important part of your project planning process. Indicates the amount and types of resources needed to perform each activity. These estimated resource requirements for the consumer market study that we've been using so far. We know that Mbali is busy with it, Steve, Subu, as well as Jim. We know that Mbali does a couple of activities, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 8. And Steve does 5 and 6 and 9. And Sibu does 7 and 10. And Jim is responsible for 11, 12, and 13. We can calculate the work days based on the activity, the task periods that we have. And then we also have a period timetable as well. So the period timetable simply means that if this is day 1 and this is day, in this case, day 138, as we've established, then we can track that Mbali is needed from day 0 to day 40, which is roughly over there. And Jim is going to be needed from day 103 till 128, which is roughly over there. So the question is, do we employ Jim for the entire period of the project, even though he won't be busy during the beginning of the project? Or do we ask Jim to do the same things that Mbali is doing between day 41, 0 to 40, and again to 103, day 103 to day 128? It all depends. And that brings us to resource leveling. Resource leveling is about understanding the resources that you're going to need. And when we talk about resources, we generally talk about people and their time. You want to minimize the resource requirement fluctuations. You don't want a situation where your project is carrying on and you're working with 2 people and suddenly you needing 10 people for a short period of time. Why don't you want that? Or why is that such a problem? Because you're suddenly going to need extra people for a very short space of time. You have to bring them in. They might not understand the project processes. They might need time to acclimatize. And you might not have the resources to supervise them, a large group of people. And once you have a large group of people all working on something at the same time, there is an opportunity for mistakes to be made. So what you want to do is you'll try to level out your resources over the lifespan of the project. You want to attempt to keep the project schedule within the required time, which is important. And you also want to use positive slack as well. Project management information system. Project management information systems can assist in this. If the delay beyond the slack on a critical path, project will be delayed beyond the required time. So you must spend time on understanding where you're going to need your resources and how you're going to deploy your resources through the project lifespan. When we look at the concept of resource limited scheduling, and this is to develop the shortest schedule that you can have. So this is where you only have resources for a limited period of time. You try not to exceed the fixed available resources that you have. You fix available resources. You extend the project completion time if necessary, if you don't have the resources in order to complete the project properly. And also you give activities with the least slack the first priority, which means that those things that don't have slack in them or doesn't have float in them or they're on the critical path, those are the activities that you put through first and you allocate and get those done first. Delay lower priority tasks and have a look at the example that's in the textbook, which looks at the resource requirements for information systems development. You look at the 5 basic resources that's needed, which is people, hardware, software, data, and network resources. And the most common problem that you have with resource allocation is over allocation. Resources assigned to multiple tasks at the same time, conflict results in the lengthening of time. And especially if you're managing a project internally, meaning a project within an organization and all of your project team members work in their own daily job, they have a job, but then they also work on the project as well. If they're not dedicated to the project, what you find is that they have to try to split their time between working on the project and also doing their day-to-day activities as well. And there is a lot of conflict in that, and potential conflict, especially you as a project manager with their particular superior or their boss, that tells you that even though the project might be a very important project internally and might be a very important strategic project, the day-to-day activities of the organization is also important, and you're going to have to try to balance that. That's why in most cases in organizations, when there is a project, they tend to take somebody out of their day-to-day job and allocate them to a project on a permanent basis. Not a permanent basis, almost like a contractual basis. So for the life of the project, they allocated to that particular project. In terms of project management information system, they can definitely handle the resource considerations within the project. You can create and maintain lists of resources, and this is why the project management software is so important. You can store availability, rate, and cost of these resources. You can assign resources and calculate their costs very easily. You can assign a calendar to them to record availability, and also resolve over allocations for the best solution. And again, project management software is important, but it's also invaluable tool to manage the people and their schedules when you allocate resources. And that brings us to the end of this learning unit, which is quite long. It consists of 2 chapters. And the next one, we will then look at costs.